Welcome to the mysterious casebook. Tonight, Miss Marple faces the secret of the hidden letter, a note long concealed, now stirring whispers of betrayal and murder. Have you ever solved a mystery before the end? Pour yourself something warm and let the mystery begin. It was a Sunday afternoon in St. Mary, Mead, the sort of afternoon that seemed tailor-made for peaceful gossip and cucumber sandwiches. The vicarage garden, in full bloom, was alive with the delicate hum of bees and the chatter of parishioners gathered after service. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, had laid out a spread of sponge cake, seed biscuits, and pots of steaming tea, while young Alice the maid moved quietly among the guests, balancing trays with surprising steadiness. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the rose trellis, appeared to be dozing in the sunshine, her hands folded over her lace gloves. But as anyone who knew her well could attest, her sharp blue eyes missed nothing. She observed with mild interest the comings and goings of the villagers, how Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed disapprovingly at the jam tarts, how Colonel Melchett told the same story of India for the third time, and how the vicar himself seemed slightly more distracted than usual, his gaze often wandering toward the path that led out of the garden. It was a gathering as ordinary as any in the village, and yet beneath its tranquil veneer lay something discordant. Miss Marple had long since learned that even the calmest waters could conceal a dangerous current. The disturbance arrived in the form of Lydia Barton, the schoolmistress, who appeared at the gate with a face pale and strained. Her presence immediately stirred a ripple among the group, for Lydia rarely ventured out on Sundays, preferring her solitary walks across the fields. She came directly to Mrs. Clement, clutching an envelope in her hand. "I found this," she said in a hushed but urgent tone, in the vestry slipped between the pages of the old hymnals. "I thought perhaps you ought to see it." The vicar's wife, flustered, took the envelope and glanced around at the company. Curiosity quickened, the airheads bent closer, conversations faltered. Colonel Melchett peered over his spectacles with undisguised eagerness. Mrs. Price Ridley whispered something sharp into her neighbor's ear. Miss Marple, though appearing serenely detached, leaned forward just slightly. The envelope was yellowed with age, its flap unsealed, its handwriting an elegant, curling script faded yet still legible. Mrs. Clement hesitated, as though reluctant to intrude upon what was plainly meant to be private, but Lydia Barton's anxious face left little room for delay. "Go on, my dear," said the vicar gently. "Open it." The paper within crackled faintly as it unfolded. Mrs. Clement read the contents in a trembling voice, audible to all despite her attempts at restraint. "My dearest, if this letter is discovered, then the truth cannot be hidden any longer. What happened at the rectory that night was not an accident. You know as well as I who was responsible, though we have both kept our silence. If conscience pricks you, remember that there is no forgiveness for deliberate sin, and if the truth comes out, it will be the end of us both." A collective gasp passed through the gathering. The vicar took the letter from his wife's hand, frowning gravely. "This is most peculiar," he said. "It makes reference to an incident at the rectory." "But what incident? I have no recollection of anything untoward." "Anonymous too," muttered Colonel Melchett. "Coward's trick, some villagers with too much time on their hands." But the words lingered, like smoke that refused to disperse. "Not an accident. Responsible." Silence. They were phrases that lodged themselves in the minds of all present, and whispers began almost at once. Miss Marple alone seemed undisturbed. She resumed her serene posture, though behind her mild expression her thoughts moved swiftly. Letters rarely appeared in such places by mere chance. Hymnals were often borrowed, misplaced, or exchanged for one to contain a letter of so grave a tone suggested more than happenstance. The vicar cleared his throat and folded the letter, his tone more official now. "I shall keep this until I have had time to consider it. Perhaps it is nothing, a relic from long ago. In any case, it would be best not to spread idle tales. Of course, in St. Mary Mead, that was precisely what was bound to happen. By the time the last crumb of sponge cake was cleared away, the village was already alive with speculation. Some claimed the letter referred to a fire in the rectory kitchen nearly 20 years past. Others whispered about a parish clerk dismissed under mysterious circumstances. Theories multiplied with astonishing speed, each more dramatic than the last. Miss Marple, returning to her neat little cottage, paused to admire the hollyhocks along her garden wall. She had no need to rush into speculation. Secrets, she knew, had a curious way of surfacing when the right questions were asked. And if this letter was indeed tied to something darker, perhaps even a crime, it would not be the villagers' gossip, but the truth of human behavior that would eventually bring it to light. That evening, as dusk settled and lamps glowed faintly in cottage windows, word spread that Lydia Barton had not returned home. She had left the vicarage shortly after handing over the letter, claiming she was bound for her lodgings near the school. Yet no one had seen her since. By nightfall, concern gave way to alarm. A search was organized, lanterns bobbing through hedgerows and fields. It was young Tommy Ridley who, running ahead with more enthusiasm than sense, stumbled upon a figure near the footpath that wound by the churchyard wall. Lydia Barton lay crumpled in the grass, her face pale beneath the moonlight, her eyes unseeing. The faint trace of blood at her temple suggested a fall or something worse. And clasped in her hand, almost as if in defiance, was a small torn fragment of paper, its ink blurred but still legible. It bore only 3 words. It was murder. The peaceful rhythms of St. Mary Mead had been shattered, and though the villagers gasped, speculated, and whispered in horrified tones, Miss Marple simply pursed her lips, her expression unreadable. For in that moment, she alone recognized the weight of the hidden letter's words and knew the village was about to reveal more of its secrets than it ever intended. Morning in St. Mary Mead dawned with an odd stillness, as though the village itself held its breath. The mist clung low over the cottages and hedgerows, giving the familiar lanes a dreamlike air. But if the landscape was hushed, the people were anything but. News of Lydia Barton's death had spread like spilled ink, staining every corner of the parish before the church bells had even finished striking 8. At the grocer's, Mrs. Price Ridley was already holding court, her voice sharper than the scales clinking behind the counter. Mark my words, it was not a simple accident. People do not just collapse in the churchyard unless there is a reason. And that letter, I should not be surprised if it were connected. One never knows what a school mistress might get herself mixed up in. She was always rather reserved, was she not? Reserved, yes, said Miss Hartnell, sniffing as she tucked a loaf of bread under her arm. But that doesn't mean secretive. Some of us value propriety. Propriety or not, Mrs. Price Ridley continued. There was trouble in her family, I recall. A brother with debts. It would not astonish me if those things caught up with her. From behind the counter, young Fred the assistant tried to look absorbed in stacking tins, though his ears were pink with the effort of listening. Meanwhile, at the post office, Miss Weatherby and her sister were whispering with relish over the morning mail. The Barton woman was seen speaking to Mr. Pritchard, the solicitor. Only last week, Miss Weatherby said. Suppose she had some documents, something to do with that letter, perhaps. More likely, a will, said her sister knowingly. Or a scandal. There is always a scandal. Even at the Blue Boar Inn, where the men of the village gathered, tongues wagged as freely as the beer poured. Colonel Melchett, his chest puffed out with the importance of his office, was declaring that the matter was entirely in hand. The police are investigating thoroughly, he said, though his mustache twitched uneasily. There is no need for idle gossip. Still, remarked Mr. Lumley, the innkeeper, folks say she had a scrap of paper in her hand when she was found. Strange thing, that. That was murder. Those were the words, weren't they? If that's true, well, it doesn't sound like an accident to me. Across the village, in her neat little cottage with its lace curtains and tidy garden, Miss Marple sat with her knitting in her lap, listening to her maid Florence's excited chatter. Florence, usually reserved, could scarcely contain herself. They say the poor lady had been pushed into the churchyard wall, head first, and that Colonel Melchett is keeping it quiet, but Alice, Mrs. Clement's maid, you know, swore she saw bruises on the schoolmistress's arms. Miss Marple gave a small, non-committal sound, her needles clicking softly. "People often bruise easily," she murmured, "and falls can appear more dramatic than they truly are." But her mind, sharp beneath the calm exterior, was already fitting pieces together. The letter found in the hymnal, Lydia's anxious face at the vicarage, the sudden discovery of her body mere hours later, had the unmistakable air of cause and effect. And the fragment she had clutched in her hand, those 3 damning words, suggested that Lydia herself had suspected foul play. By midday, Inspector Slack had arrived from Much Benham, full of his usual briskness. He stood in the churchyard where Lydia had been found, tapping his notebook with a pencil as if sheer force of will could make the clues confess themselves. "Unfortunate business," he muttered. "But we'll get to the bottom of it. The villagers mustn't run away with wild ideas. Barton was a sensible woman, not the sort to go fainting about. If she wrote those words, it was murder, then we must take them seriously." Colonel Melchett, who had joined him, adjusted his hat with an air of authority. "The letter discovered yesterday must be examined further. I don't like coincidences. First a mysterious note about an old crime, and then a sudden death. It smacks of mischief, slack and deliberate mischief at that." Miss Marple, who had come quietly to pay her respects, stood a little apart from the men. She looked at the churchyard wall, tracing with her eyes the rough stones where Lydia might have struck her head. She noted the way the grass was flattened, as if there had been a brief struggle. To most, it would look unremarkable, but Miss Marple knew how to read the language of small details. Later that afternoon, the vicarage became the center of speculation once more. Mrs. Clement, pale with worry, received visitors who arrived under the guise of offering sympathy, but who, in truth, longed for a morsel of new information. "I cannot imagine what poor Lydia was doing with such a letter," Mrs. Clement confessed to Miss Marple in a low tone. "It was hidden away for who knows how long, and then this. It feels like something dreadful has been awoken." "Yes, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly, patting her hand. "Old secrets have a way of rising to the surface, much like cream on milk, and once they do, they cannot easily be pressed down again." The doorbell rang, and Mr. Pritchard, the solicitor, was shown in. He looked grave, his dark suit immaculate, his manner cautious. "I heard terrible news," he said. "I must ask, was Miss Barton in possession of any papers when she died? Anything she might have brought from the vestry?" The vicar, frowning, produced the letter. "This is all we know of. You may look, though it seems to me nothing more than a relic of the past." Mr. Pritchard read it, his brows knitting. "Curious. This handwriting is familiar to me, though I cannot at the moment place it. Old, yes, but not so old as one might suppose. And the reference to an accident at the rectory, I would like to consider what that might mean." When he had gone, Miss Marple quietly observed, "It is remarkable, is it not, how a mere scrap of paper can disturb so many minds? People are rarely upset by things that have no bearing on them. One must always ask oneself who benefits from silence and who trembles at the thought of truth." That evening, the village hummed with speculation. Some were convinced Lydia had been silenced because she knew too many others whispered of lovers' quarrels, debts unpaid, or long-forgotten scandals. At every cottage gate and along every hedgerow path, voices carried theories and eyes darted with suspicion. Only Miss Marple sat calmly at her window, the lamplight falling across her knitting. She thought of Lydia Barton's pale, strained face as she had handed over the letter. Fear had been written there as plain as day, though few had cared to notice it. And if Lydia had died with the words, "It was murder," upon her lips, or at least upon her scrap of paper, it meant she had seen something, or someone just before her end. The village would speculate endlessly. The police would gather statements, weigh evidence, and search for logical explanations. But Miss Marple knew that the truth would not lie in documents or physical signs. It would lie in the patterns of human behavior, in who had reason to fear exposure, and in who had once before been willing to hide behind silence. As the church bells tolled 9, Miss Marple folded her knitting and set it aside. Her face was thoughtful, her eyes alert. Somewhere among the familiar cottages and gardens of St. Mary Mead, someone carried a deadly secret, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, intended to discover precisely who it was. Inspector Slack returned the following morning, striding into the village with his notebook at the ready and an air of authority he clearly hoped would silence the more excitable tongues of St. Mary Mead. But the inspector, though brisk and energetic, had never quite managed to appreciate the peculiar ways of small communities. The more he dismissed gossip, the more it spread, sprouting like dandelions along every garden path. Miss Marple, however, never dismissed anything out of hand. She strolled down the high street at a leisurely pace, pausing here and there to exchange polite greetings, her face the very picture of harmless curiosity. In truth, she was listening keenly to the fragments of conversation that slipped through open shop doors and over hedgerows. It was astonishing how much could be learned when one appeared not to be listening at all. At the greengrocer's, she overheard Mrs. Hartnell informed anyone who would listen that Lydia Barton had been seen speaking with the vicar on more than one occasion in recent weeks. Not in any improper way, mind you, she hastened to add, but rather with the air of someone burdened by a heavy conscience. At the milliner's, Miss Weatherby was whispering that she had once glimpsed Lydia carrying a packet of old letters bound with string. "It gave me quite a start," she confided in her sister. "One doesn't expect the schoolmistress to be mixed up in clandestine matters, and at the post office, Mrs. Price Ridley announced that she had it on good authority that Lydia had quarreled with someone only days before her death. Who that someone was, of course, she did not specify, though her sharp eyes glittered with the pleasure of keeping others in suspense. By mid-morning, Inspector Slack had summoned several villagers to the vicarage for questioning. Miss Marple, with the air of one who had simply wandered in by accident, took a quiet seat near the window where she could observe without intruding. Colonel Melchett was first to be questioned. "Did you know Miss Barton well, Colonel?" Slack asked. "Well enough," the colonel replied briskly. "She taught Latin to my nephews. A capable woman, though a bit too severe in her manner. I cannot say I had much personal acquaintance with her. Did she confide in you at all? Speaking of troubles." "Not in the least. School mistresses, in my experience, are not given confidence." Mrs. Clement was next, her hands fluttering as she spoke. She seemed distressed, yes, but I thought it was simply the strain of teaching. She mentioned once that she had found something in the vestry, though she did not say what until she brought me that letter. Oh, Inspector, if only I had insisted she let me keep it sooner. Miss Marple noted the words with interest. Lydia had hinted at her discovery before the day of the garden party. That suggested forethought and fear. When Mr. Pritchard, the solicitor, was called in, his expression remained grave. I had business with Miss Barton regarding her small savings. Nothing unusual. She was cautious with her money, perhaps more cautious than most. I can add nothing further, I'm afraid. Inspector Slack frowned. "And yet you recognized the handwriting on that letter, did you not?" Mr. Pritchard hesitated. "I said it looked familiar, yes. But I cannot say with certainty whose hand it is. One sees a great many letters in the course of one's work." Miss Marple, watching closely, noticed the faintest tightening around his mouth, as if he spoke more than he wished to reveal. When the questioning concluded, the inspector declared, We have established little, but the matter of that letter must be pursued. If it refers to an old crime, then someone in this village has cause to keep it buried." The villagers murmured among themselves, faces pale and uneasy. Secrets, Miss Marple thought, were never more dangerous than when dragged unwillingly into the light. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a quiet call to the schoolhouse. The desks stood empty, slates stacked neatly, chalk dust lingering faintly in the air. Lydia Barton's lodgings adjoined the classroom, and though the police had made a cursory inspection, Miss Marple believed a woman's eye might detect what men so often overlooked. The room was modest: a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a writing desk with ink and paper neatly arranged. On the window-sill stood a small vase of wildflowers, already wilting. Miss Marple glanced about with the practiced eye of one who had spent a lifetime observing human habits. On the writing desk lay a pile of exercise books awaiting correction, Lydia's precise handwriting marching across the pages. Nothing unusual there. But in the top drawer, beneath a handkerchief and some sewing needles, Miss Marple found a scrap of notepaper torn from a larger sheet. Upon it was scrawled in a hurried and uneven hand, "If they discover the truth, everything will be lost." Miss Marple's brows knitted slightly. It was not the same hand as the elegant script in the hymnal letter, but it bore the unmistakable marks of haste and desperation. She replaced the scrap exactly as she had found it, knowing the inspector must be told, yet turning the words over in her mind. On her way back through the village, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Price Ridley, who could not resist stopping her. Mark my words, Miss Marple, it was young Tommy Ridley who saw too much. He was the one who found her, after all. Children often know more than they ought. Miss Marple smiled gently. Children observe keenly, indeed, but they rarely understand what they see. That can be more dangerous than knowing outright. As she walked on, she reflected that children were often unwitting witnesses, but rarely inventors of falsehood. If Tommy had noticed something unusual, it might prove useful later if only one asked the right questions. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the church spire and the village lamps flickered to life, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting needles moving in steady rhythm. Her mind, however, was anything but tranquil. There were now two writings of interest, the carefully penned letter in the hymnal and the hurried note in Lydia Barton's drawer. One spoke of a deliberate sin hidden in the past. The other hinted at discovery and loss. Together, they formed the outline of a secret too dangerous for Lydia to live with and perhaps too dangerous for someone else to allow her to keep. The inspector would look for fingerprints, for footprints in the grass, for witnesses who had seen Lydia on her last walk. But Miss Marple knew the answer would not lie in such evidence. It would be found in the small, unguarded behaviors of the villagers, in the way Mr. Pritchard's mouth tightened, in the fluttering hands of Mrs. Clement, in the relish with which Mrs. Price Ridley spread her tales. Human nature, Miss Marple thought, was far more revealing than any scientific clue. And in the days to come, she intended to watch very closely indeed. Inspector Slack, never one to waste time, began the fourth day of his investigation with a certainty that impressed many but convinced few. Murderers, he declared at the Blue Boar Inn, are never as clever as they believe. One must simply look at the facts. He tapped his notebook for emphasis, though the pages within were far less conclusive than his tone suggested. The facts, as Slack presented them, were that Lydia Barton had been in possession of a letter hinting at some long-buried scandal. She had died within hours of making it public at the vicarage garden party, and she had been seen speaking to two people of interest in the days preceding her death: Mr. Pritchard, the solicitor, and Alice, the maid at the vicarage. Between the two of them, Slack announced, "We may well find our culprit." The villagers, ever eager for direction, seized upon the theory with enthusiasm. At the grocer's, Mrs. Price Ridley wasted no time in proclaiming that Mr. Pritchard had always struck her as altogether too smooth by half. At the post office, Miss Weatherby whispered that Alice the maid had been seen crying behind the churchyard gate only a fortnight ago. And at the Blue Boar, Colonel Melchett puffed himself up with agreement, though his knowledge extended no further than what Slack had already declared. Miss Marple, meanwhile, kept her observations to herself. She found Inspector Slack's conclusions hasty, as usual. Pritchard's reticence might easily spring from professional caution rather than guilt. And Alice, though nervous, was a girl of 17, more likely to cry from a scolding or a quarrel with a beau than from murderous intent. Nevertheless, Miss Marple knew better than to dismiss Slack's suspects outright. Even the most unlikely individuals might prove capable of desperate acts when cornered by circumstance. That afternoon, Slack summoned Alice to the vicarage for questioning. The poor girl appeared pale and trembling, her apron twisted in her hands. "You were near the vestry the day Miss Barton found the letter," Slack said sharply. "Did you see her place it in her pocket? Did she confide anything to you?" Alice shook her head rapidly. "No, sir, only that she looked troubled. She asked me to fetch her a glass of water, and when I returned she had gone. I don't know anything more, sir." "You don't know anything more," Slack corrected with a scowl. "And yet you were seen near the churchyard the evening of her death." "I often walk that way, sir. It's the short cut to my mother's cottage." Slack eyed her with suspicion. "Convenient, isn't it?" Alice burst into tears, protesting her innocence. Miss Marple, who had slipped quietly into the vicarage drawing-room, regarded the girl with kindly eyes. She noted the way Alice's fingers fumbled nervously, the way her gaze darted toward the door as though longing to flee. But she also noted something else, the raw, unpracticed nature of her distress. Guilty people, Miss Marple knew, were often more controlled than innocent ones. After Alice was dismissed, Mr. Pritchard was ushered in. He stood erect, his manner guarded, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Mr. Pritchard," said Slack, "you admitted the handwriting in the letter looked familiar. Will you now confirm whose hand it is?" The solicitor adjusted his spectacles. "Inspector, I will not make a declaration without certainty. A solicitor's work demands caution. If I spoke falsely, I could do irreparable harm. Or perhaps," Slack said, narrowing his eyes, "you fear that telling the truth would do harm to yourself." Mr. Pritchard stiffened. "That is a grave accusation, Inspector. I had no quarrel with Miss Barton, nor any connection to this letter beyond a vague recognition of its script." Miss Marple watched the exchange with quiet interest. The man's tone was measured, his composure admirable. But when Slack mentioned self-interest, a flicker of discomfort passed across his features. It was there and gone in an instant, but to Miss Marple's trained eye it was as telling as a confession. When the questioning ended, Slack declared to Colonel Melchett, "It's plain enough. Barton stumbled onto something that threatened Pritchard, and now she's dead." "Logical, certainly," said Melchett, though his tone was more doubtful than convinced. Miss Marple, however, sat silently, her needles clicking in her lap. Logic was useful, but human nature, she knew, was rarely tidy enough to fit into the inspector's neat little boxes. That evening, the village buzzed anew. Some were convinced of Pritchard's guilt, others whispered that Alice's tears were only a performance. Suspicion thickened the air, and neighbors eyed one another with unease. At her cottage, Miss Marple received a visit from Mrs. Clement, who wrung her hands anxiously. "Jane, do you truly think Alice could be guilty? She is a silly, nervous girl, but I cannot believe she is capable of such wickedness." "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "it is rarely the outwardly nervous who commit dreadful deeds. More often, it is those who appear entirely ordinary, even dull. Human nature has its patterns, and one must be careful to recognize them." Mrs. Clement sighed, relieved yet unsettled. And Mr. Pritchard? Could it be him? Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. He is cautious, perhaps secretive, but secrecy too has many causes, some innocent, some not. We must not rush to judgment. Later that night, as Miss Marple sat alone by her fire, she reflected on the inspector's conclusions. His eagerness to close the case was understandable. Villagers demanded answers, and the longer suspicion lingered, the more restless they would become. But Lydia Barton's death, coupled with the letter and the hurried note in her drawer, suggested a deeper and more deliberate pattern than mere opportunity. It was not enough to know who had the chance. One must know who had the fear. And so Miss Marple resolved to watch carefully in the days ahead for the small slips of behavior, the hurried words, the looks exchanged when people thought no one noticed. The inspector might pursue suspects with his blunt questioning, but Miss Marple would pursue truth with quiet patience. In St. Mary Mead, truth had a way of surfacing if only one waited long enough and looked in the right places. And Jane Marple, with her unassuming air and keen eyes, intended to do exactly that. The following morning, Inspector Slack paraded through the High Street with renewed vigor, clearly pleased with the direction his inquiries had taken. "Matters are clarifying," he told Colonel Melchett, who walked stiffly at his side. "It will not be long before we secure sufficient evidence for an arrest." But in truth, the evidence was thin and the doubts plentiful. St. Mary Mead hummed with whispers, each villager interpreting Lydia Barton's death in their own fashion, and yet none with true certainty. For Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her parlor with her knitting basket by her side, it was precisely within these uncertain spaces that truth had room to hide. That afternoon, she decided to call upon the church. The vestry, where the mysterious letter had been discovered, remained a place of quiet significance. The door creaked as she entered, the air cool and faintly musty, scented with old wood and hymnals. Sunlight slanted through narrow windows, catching dust motes that drifted lazily in the stillness. To most, the room held nothing unusual. A row of hymns, a table for parish records, a chest for vestments. But Miss Marple's eyes moved with the thoroughness of one accustomed to observing trifles, others dismissed. She ran a gloved hand lightly along the spines of the hymnals, pausing at the shelf where Lydia had made her discovery. It was there she noticed something curious. Between two hymnals, the wood bore faint scratches, as if the volumes had been removed and replaced with unusual frequency. To anyone else, it might have seemed the ordinary wear of church books. But Miss Marple, recalling Lydia's anxious demeanor, wondered if the school mistress had known exactly where to look. She drew out one hymnal and flipped through its pages. Nothing. Another followed, its leaves clean except for the usual penciled notes of page numbers. Yet in the third, near the back, she found a slip of paper, folded small enough to be nearly invisible against the binding. Unfolded carefully, it revealed only a list of initials and dates: R.C. March, 1912. P.W. April, 1912. L.S. July, 1913. And so it continued, a neat column of cryptic references stretching across the yellowed paper. Miss Marple studied it with pursed lips. To the police, it would appear meaningless, but she recognized a certain pattern in the notations, the sort of careful record-keeping that hinted at something deliberate, even clandestine. Parish records, perhaps, though none she had ever seen kept in this fashion. Replacing the slip where she had found it, Miss Marple allowed herself the faintest of smiles. A clue, she thought, though not one Slack would value. He would see no blood stains, no confessions, no tangible link to Lydia's death. But Miss Marple knew the importance of patterns. People who concealed things often betrayed themselves by the very manner of their concealment. When she left the vestry, she encountered Florence, her maid, hurrying toward the vicarage with a basket. "Good afternoon, Florence," Miss Marple greeted mildly. "Errands for Mrs. Clement?" Florence nodded. Yes, ma'am. Though between you and me, the whole vicarage is in a state. The inspector's been there again, pressing poor Alice something dreadful. He says she's holding back the truth. Perhaps she is, Miss Marple replied softly, though perhaps she's not even aware of it. We often know more than we realize, and less than others believe. At the vicarage, the scene was indeed strained. Alice had been questioned once more and sent away in tears. Mrs. Clement, flustered and pale, confided in Miss Marple that she feared the girl might be dismissed under suspicion alone. It seems unfair, Mrs. Clement whispered. Alice may be foolish, but she is not wicked. Miss Marple patted her hand. The truth, my dear, has a way of showing itself. We must be patient. That evening, the inspector gathered several villagers at the Blue Boar Inn, hoping to impress them with progress. He held up the hymnal letter for dramatic effect. This is the heart of the matter, he declared, a confession of sorts. If we can identify the writer, we shall find the killer. But when pressed for details, he could produce none. And when Mr. Pritchard repeated with firm insistence that he could not name the hand with certainty, Slack's authority wavered. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively near the fire, let her gaze drift across the assembled faces. She watched how Mrs. Price Ridley leaned forward eagerly, her lips pursed in disdain for Pritchard. She observed the Colonel's restless tapping of his cane, the way his eyes slid toward the door whenever Slack's questions grew too pointed. And she noticed something else when Slack mentioned the hymnal once more. Alice the maid, standing at the back with a tray, visibly started, nearly dropping a glass. Later, Miss Marple asked her gently, "You looked startled, my dear, when the inspector spoke of the hymnals. Have you seen Miss Barton searching among them before?" Alice stammered, cheeks pink. "Only once, ma'am. She asked me to keep watch at the vestry door while she looked. She said it was nothing, just a matter of tidying. But she seemed so flustered. I thought it best not to mention it." Miss Marple nodded slowly. A hidden clue indeed, one overlooked by nearly everyone. Lydia Barton had not stumbled upon the letter by chance. She had been searching deliberately, and perhaps more than once. Someone had guided her, or someone had wanted her to find it. When Miss Marple returned home that night, she placed her knitting aside and gazed thoughtfully into the fire. The initials on the paper, the scratches on the hymnal shelf, Lydia's determined search-all pointed to a secret long hidden, one that touched more lives in St. Mary Mead than most would suspect. The inspector would continue chasing suspects, pushing and prodding until one broke under pressure. But Miss Marple knew the real answer lay not in brute questioning, but in uncovering why Lydia had sought out that letter and who had reason to fear what it revealed. And as the fire crackled softly in her hearth, Miss Marple thought she had glimpsed the faint outline of the truth, like a shadow moving just beyond the corner of one's vision, waiting for the moment it would step into the light. The days following Miss Marple's discovery in the vestry saw the mood in St. Mary Mead grow heavy, almost suffocating. What had once been a village of gentle chatter and familiar routines now simmered with suspicion. Neighbors avoided one another's eyes. Gossip that once sounded harmless now carried the bite of accusation. It was as though Lydia Barton's death had stripped away a layer of civility, leaving behind something raw and uneasy. Colonel Melchett attempted to restore order by hosting a meeting in the parish hall, ostensibly to calm nerves and dispel rumors. "We must all keep our heads," he declared, his voice firm but his expression betraying strain. "The police are handling matters competently. Wild speculation will serve no purpose." Yet speculation was precisely what the meeting produced. Mrs. Price Ridley rose to her feet, her lips pursed. "I think it only proper to say, Colonel, that the solicitor, Mr. Pritchard, has acted most suspiciously. If he truly recognized the handwriting on that dreadful letter, why did he not speak plainly? What honest man hesitates to tell the truth?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Mr. Pritchard, who had attended reluctantly, flushed with indignation. "Madam, you go too far. A solicitor is bound by discretion. To make a reckless accusation could ruin reputations unjustly. Would you have me fling about names like a fishmonger tossing herrings? Better a fishmonger than a coward, Mrs. Price Ridley snapped. Gasps rose from the assembly. The vicar hastened to intervene, appealing for charity of speech. But the damage was done. The meeting had laid bare the tensions simmering beneath the village's surface, and suspicion clung to Pritchard like a shadow. Later, outside the hall, Miss Marple overheard a quieter confrontation. Alice the maid stood with Florence, Miss Marple's own housemaid, her eyes red from recent tears. "I swear I didn't mean to keep secrets," Alice whispered, "but Miss Barton, she asked me not to tell. Said it was for my own good. What was I to do?" Florence, ever curious, leaned closer. "Tell what?" Alice shook her head, glancing nervously around. "I promised. But it wasn't anything wicked, I don't think. Only something about the vestry." Miss Marple, pausing in the shadow of the hedge, considered the girl's words. Promises made under pressure often concealed truths far larger than the one confessed. The next morning brought another revelation. Mrs. Clement, looking pale and drawn, called upon Miss Marple with a troubled expression. "My dear Jane," she said, clasping her hands tightly, "I feel I must confide in you. I have not told the inspector everything. I could not bear the thought of scandal, you see, and yet my conscience is pricked. Lydia Barton came to me not once, but twice, about that letter. The first time was a week ago. She seemed very agitated, asking if the vicar kept any old records from before our time here. When I said I thought not, she grew pale and said, 'Then it must still be in the hymnals.' She begged me not to speak of it." Miss Marple listened quietly, her eyes thoughtful. "And you said nothing to the inspector?" "I feared it would sound absurd, but now I cannot help but wonder if she had already guessed at something dangerous." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, "secrets are often dangerous, particularly when one stumbles too close to the heart of them." Meanwhile, Inspector Slack pressed forward with his inquiries, though his heavy-handed methods earned him little affection in the village. He confronted Pritchard again in his office, demanding an explanation for his reluctance to name the handwriting. Pritchard's composure cracked under the strain. "Very well, Inspector. If you must know, I believe the writing resembles that of Reverend Channing, our former vicar, now long deceased. He served here until 1913. But what good does it do to accuse the dead? He cannot have killed Miss Barton." Slack's eyes narrowed. And yet the letter spoke of an incident at the rectory. If Channing was involved, others must have known others still alive today. And if Miss Barton uncovered it, perhaps someone feared exposure. The solicitor tightened his jaw. "You twist matters, Inspector. I will tell you only what I recall. I will not be made into your scapegoat." Word of the confrontation spread swiftly, and by evening the village was abuzz with talk of Reverend Channing. Old stories resurfaced, whispers of a fire in the rectory kitchen, a servant girl dismissed suddenly, accounts of late-night visitors whose names were never recorded. The past, long buried, stirred uneasily in the present. Miss Marple, sitting by her fire, reflected on these tales with the calm detachment of one who had lived long enough to see patterns repeat. Kuman, nature. Florence, she told her maid, is much the same in 1913 as it is in 1937. People quarrel, conceal, and protect themselves in the same ways. The costumes may change, but the play remains remarkably consistent. The true turning point came that night, when Alice appeared at Miss Marple's cottage, pale and trembling. "I can't keep it in any longer," she whispered, wringing her hands. "Miss Barton made me promise. But she's gone now, and I don't know who else to trust. She told me she had found more than one letter. The one in the hymnal wasn't the first. She had another hidden in her desk. She said it proved something about the rectory fire, something that would ruin a good many people if it came out." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And where is this other letter now, my dear? Alice's voice faltered. "I don't know. After she died, I was too frightened to look. But I think someone must have taken it. Her desk was open when I went by the schoolhouse, and the drawer where she kept her papers was empty." Miss Marple thanked her gently, offering tea to steady her nerves. But when Alice departed, the elderly spinster sat long into the night, her mind busy with connections. Lydia Barton had uncovered not one but several letters, each pointing to a secret buried in the rectory's past. Someone had known and someone had acted to silence her. The villagers' confrontations, their half-confessions, their whispered recollections of Reverend Channing, these were not idle tales. They were pieces of a pattern, fragments of a truth too dangerous for some to bear. And Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, was determined to fit them together. The 7th day after Lydia Barton's death dawned with a brittle chill in the air, though it was only late spring. The church bells rang as they always did, but in St. Mary Mead there was no sense of calm. Instead, the village hummed with restless tension. Neighbors who had once exchanged pleasantries over garden hedges now crossed the street to avoid each other. Every face carried a question: who among them had murdered the schoolmistress? Inspector Slack, for his part, remained confident that the net was tightening around Mr. Pritchard. He announced as much to Colonel Melchett over breakfast at the Blue Boar. "He admits the handwriting resembled Reverend Channing's," Slack said, "and if those letters were written by the old vicar, then Pritchard knows far more than he claims. Mark my words, Melchett, Pritchard is holding something back." Melchett, though inclined to trust authority, shifted uneasily. Yes, but one cannot arrest a man merely for discretion. And the village is in uproar, Slack. The more you press him without proof, the worse it will become. Proof, however, was about to arrive, though not in the form Slack expected. That afternoon, young Tommy Ridley, the boy who had first found Lydia's body, came racing breathlessly to the vicarage with a startling discovery. "I saw it," he cried, eyes wide. "I saw someone throw something into the mill pond." Mrs. Clement, startled, hurried to fetch the inspector. Within the hour, Slack, Melchett, and half the village had gathered at the edge of the pond. The water was murky, choked with reeds, but with the help of a long pole they managed to draw up a sodden bundle wrapped in oilcloth. When it was unwrapped, gasps rippled through the onlookers. Inside were several letters, their ink blurred by water but still faintly legible. Though damaged, they bore the same elegant, curling handwriting as the first letter found in the hymnal. "More letters," Colonel Melchett exclaimed. Then Barton was right, there was a cache of them. Slack, triumphant, puffed out his chest, and who better to dispose of them than the solicitor? He would know their value and their danger. But Miss Marple, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, tilted her head slightly. "It is curious, is it not, that the bundle should be thrown into the pond only now? If the letters had been hidden for years, why destroy them after Lydia's death, when suspicion was already roused? It suggests that someone panicked, someone who feared that more evidence might surface." Her words fell into the murmur like a pebble dropped into water, rippling outward. Slack frowned, but said nothing. The damaged letters were carried to the vicarage, where the vicar and Mrs. Clement attempted to dry them by the fire. Fragments were lost, ink smeared beyond recognition, but certain phrases emerged from the accident at the rectory we swore to silence. If discovered, reputations ruined. It was enough to inflame speculation further. Who had sworn to silence? Whose reputations were at stake? The village, already a cauldron of whispers, now boiled over. That evening, Mr. Pritchard was accosted outside his office by none other than Mrs. Price Ridley, who wasted no time in delivering her verdict. "You knew of these letters, sir, and you sought to conceal them. What decent man allows such wickedness to go unchallenged?" Pritchard's composure cracked. "Madame, I have concealed nothing. I did not even know of their existence until Miss Barton showed me the first. Do you think I am foolish enough to risk my career by dabbling in such matters? You're clever enough, certainly, she retorted. That makes you all the more dangerous. The quarrel was overheard by several villagers, and by nightfall Pritchard's name was spoken with more suspicion than ever. Yet the true twist came not from Pritchard, but from a source no one expected. The following morning, Alice the maid appeared at Miss Marple's cottage, pale and trembling. In her hands she held a scrap of paper, damp but legible. "I found it, ma'am," she whispered. "It must have slipped loose from the bundle before they threw it into the pond. I daren't give it to the inspector. He'll only say I'm meddling. But I thought you should see it." Miss Marple accepted the paper with calm hands, though her heart quickened. The writing, though blurred, was clear enough to read. If Channing's folly is ever uncovered, the blame will not fall upon him alone. Others were present. Others must bear the guilt. Miss Marple folded the paper carefully. "You were right to bring this to me, my dear, and you must say nothing of it to anyone else, not yet." Alice nodded fervently. "I won't breathe a word. But it frightens me, ma'am. Who are these others? What if one of them is still alive, here in the village?" Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on the girl's arm. "Then we must be very observant indeed. Fear often makes people reveal more than they intend." That evening, Miss Marple reflected upon the twist the case had taken. Until now, suspicion had settled heavily on Pritchard, convenient though unconvincing. But these new letters suggested a wider circle of guilt, tied not merely to one man, but to several. If Reverend Channing's folly had involved others, then Lydia Barton had uncovered a conspiracy of silence reaching back over 20 years. And when such silence is threatened, Miss Marple knew, people are often willing to kill to preserve it. She recalled Mrs. Clement's confession, the solicitor's discomfort, Alice's trembling promise, and the Colonel's evasive manner. Each, in their way, had shown signs of unease. Which of them feared the past most keenly? Which of them would risk everything to keep it hidden? The inspector would no doubt seize upon this twist as further proof of Pritchard's guilt. But Miss Marple, with her long memory and her deep understanding of human frailty, suspected otherwise. The truth lay not with the most obvious suspect, but with the one who best understood the power of silence and the cost of breaking it. As the church bells tolled once more across St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple set down her knitting and gazed into the fire. Somewhere among her neighbors, someone bore the weight of an old sin, and as long as the letters continued to surface, that person would grow more desperate. Desperation, Miss Marple knew, was the surest path to revelation. The discovery of the sodden letters had unsettled St. Mary Mead more than any single event since the war. In a village so small, where each person believed themselves to know every quirk and history of their neighbors, the suggestion of hidden sins was intolerable. Everywhere one went, conversation stopped mid-sentence. People glanced over their shoulders as though fearful of being overheard. Children were hushed indoors, shutters were drawn earlier than usual, and the Blue Boar's common room buzzed with theories, each wilder than the last. Inspector Slack, buoyed by what he considered fresh evidence, was more determined than ever to press his case against Mr. Pritchard. "The man's evasions condemn him," he told Colonel Melchett. "A guilty conscience writes itself upon the face, and his is plain as a pikestaff. Mark me, Melchett, it is only a matter of days before we have him in irons." Melchett, though less confident, nodded out of habit. But Miss Marple, who happened to be sitting in the corner of the Blue Boar with her knitting, concealed a tiny smile. She knew Slack's eagerness well. It was the sort of zeal that often blinded men to subtler truths. That evening, Miss Marple received a visit from the vicar's wife. Mrs. Clement, her eyes shadowed by sleepless nights, confessed her growing dread. Jane, the inspector, insists Alice must know more than she admits. He says if the girl does not confess soon, he will take steps to compel her. Miss Marple laid aside her knitting. Compulsion, my dear, often produces falsehoods rather than truths. It is far better to let a young girl speak in her own time. Mrs. Clement's eyes filled with tears. I do not know what to think any longer. The whole village feels poisoned. And those letters to speak of Reverend Channing in such a way, even now it chills me. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. But it is not the words themselves that matter most, but the effect they have on the living. The dead are beyond harm, but the living fear exposure more keenly than death itself. The following day, Miss Marple determined to observe her neighbors with more deliberate intent. She had no authority like the inspector, nor the bluster of Colonel Melchett, but she had something far more valuable, an unassuming air. People spoke freely before her, believing her harmless, and it was in their unguarded words and glances that truth often appeared. Her first call was upon Mr. Pritchard. She found him in his office, sorting papers with mechanical precision. His face bore lines of strain, though he tried to maintain a veneer of calm. "My dear Mr. Pritchard," Miss Marple began mildly, "I could not help but think of you when I heard the latest news. It must be most unpleasant having people whisper your name in such a fashion. Villages can be cruel when suspicion takes root." The solicitor gave a short, bitter laugh. "Cruel indeed, Miss Marple. I have devoted my life to discretion and duty, and what is my reward? To be branded a villain by the likes of Mrs. Price Ridley. People often accuse others of what they fear themselves," Miss Marple remarked gently. "It is a curious quirk of human nature. But you, I am sure, have nothing to fear from the truth." Her eyes rested steadily on him as she spoke. For the briefest moment, his composure faltered. His hands stilled upon the papers, his jaw tightened. Then he forced a smile. "Truth is a slippery commodity, Miss Marple. It rarely satisfies everyone." She left him soon after, her expression serene, though inwardly she noted the discomfort her words had produced. Guilt or merely resentment? Time would tell. Her next visit was to Colonel Melchett. She found him pacing his study, cane tapping the floor in agitation. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, forcing a smile. "You come to scold me, no doubt, for allowing slack to run riot with the villagers." "Not scolding, Colonel," she replied kindly, "only to suggest that sometimes firmness must be tempered with patience. People are like young plants, press them too hard, and they wither. Give them space, and they reveal themselves." The Colonel chuckled ruefully. "You may be right. Still, one cannot let matters drift. The inspector believes Barton was silenced because she stumbled too near the truth. And I cannot deny it seems plausible." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Yes, very plausible. Yet we must ask why now. If these letters have lain hidden for over 20 years, why should their discovery prove fatal only today?" Melchett paused, frowning. "A fair point, Miss Marple. A fair point indeed." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the schoolhouse. Though shuttered since Lydia's death, the air around it seemed heavy with secrets. She encountered Alice standing near the gate, wringing her hands. "Oh, Miss Marple," the girl whispered, "I'm frightened. Everyone looks at me as though I know more than I do. I cannot bear it." Miss Marple took her hand gently. "My dear, fear is often misplaced. People suspect you because you are young and uncertain. But it is the calm and certain faces we must watch most closely. They are the ones who hide the deepest secrets." Alice looked up, eyes wide. "Do you think I should tell the inspector about the other letter, the one Miss Barton spoke of but never showed me?" Miss Marple shook her head slightly. "Not yet, child. There is a right moment for every truth. Speak too soon and it may be twisted. Hold it too long and it may be lost. We must wait for the moment when words strike with precision." That evening, Miss Marple reflected upon her quiet confrontations. Each had revealed something small, yet significant. Pritchard's unease, Melchett's unspoken doubts, Alice's trembling fear. Human nature, she thought, was like embroidery seen from the back. A tangle of knots and threads appeared, but from the front a clear pattern emerged. And now she sensed the pattern growing clearer. The bundle of letters had shifted suspicion, widening the circle of guilt to include more than one. Someone had panicked and tried to destroy them, only to be thwarted. And panic, Miss Marple knew, was the undoing of even the most careful schemer. She resolved that her next step would be more deliberate. A quiet word here, an innocent question there, nothing overt, nothing to alarm. But she would watch closely for the flicker in the eyes, the tremor in the voice, the sudden silence where there should have been none. The inspector might brandish his authority, but Jane Marple would weave her net from the subtleties of human weakness, and when the moment came, she would know precisely which thread to pull, and the whole tangled skein of secrets would unravel. The atmosphere in St. Mary Mead had thickened into something close to dread. Villagers still went about their routine shopping, tending gardens, attending to their hens, but there was a heaviness behind every exchange of pleasantries. A wrong look, an unanswered greeting, the smallest hesitation, all were interpreted as signs of guilt. The village that had once prided itself on harmony now felt like a stage set for whispered accusations. Inspector Slack, for his part, was determined to close the case. He summoned Mr. Pritchard yet again, pressing him with renewed vigor. The handwriting, the evasions, the letters in the pondit, all points to you, sir. If you know more than you are saying, I shall have no choice but to act. Pritchard, pale with strain, protested vehemently. Inspector, you mistake discretion for guilt. I tell you the writing was Reverend Channing's. Beyond that, I know nothing. Must I be condemned because I refuse to speculate irresponsibly? Slack left dissatisfied, though still convinced of his theory. Colonel Melchett, standing nearby, muttered under his breath, "You are making an enemy of half the parish, Slack." Miss Marple, who had watched the exchange quietly, knew Slack's determination blinded him to subtler signs. It was not Pritchard's words that interested her, but his hand, trembling ever so slightly as he adjusted his spectacles. A man fearful of ruin, yes, but not necessarily because of murder. That afternoon, Miss Marple called upon Mrs. Price Ridley. The formidable woman welcomed her with the satisfaction of one who knew herself to be a source of news. "You will have heard," Mrs. Price Ridley began at once, "that Pritchard is all but finished. Everyone knows he must be guilty. Too secretive by half, that man. And his family, you know, had its troubles. I recall a scandal with a cousin embezzlement or something of the sort. It runs in the blood." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "Indeed, family likenesses do crop up in surprising ways. And yet, it is curious how eager we are to believe in guilt when it suits our opinion of a person. I often think, Mrs. Price Ridley, that the most dangerous secrets are those belonging to people we least suspect." The older woman sniffed. "Then you must think someone else is guilty, Miss Marple." "Who, I wonder?" "Oh, I should not presume," Miss Marple replied, her knitting needles clicking gently. "But I do find it interesting that Lydia Barton spoke of others being present at the rectory years ago. It suggests a company of sorts, not one solitary man." Mrs. Price Ridley fell silent at that, her eyes darting away. Later, Miss Marple paid a call on Mrs. Clement. The vicar's wife was clearly overwrought, pacing the drawing room with a handkerchief clutched tightly in her hand. "My dear Jane, I hardly know where to turn," she confessed. "The inspector presses us for details, but what can I say? I never knew Reverend Channing, and yet these letters suggest he and perhaps others were involved in something dreadful. The vicar is distraught at the thought of scandal tainting the parish." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Scandal, my dear, is often worse in the imagination than in truth. And yet truth, however painful, has a way of freeing us." Mrs. Clement sat heavily. Lydia Barton must have known something very precise. She said once in passing that certain people still living would tremble if the truth emerged. I thought she spoke dramatically, but perhaps she was right. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Lydia was frightened, but also determined. She did not search the hymns idly. She had been guided or warned, and she believed what she found would change everything. The following morning, Miss Marple chose a new course. She invited Alice the maid to tea at her cottage, offering cakes and gentle company until the girl's nerves settled. "You said, my dear," Miss Marple reminded her gently, "that Miss Barton spoke of another letter, one kept in her desk. I wonder if she ever told you whose name it contained." Alice hesitated, twisting her napkin. "Only that it wasn't just Reverend Channing. She said there were initials, more than one, and she was certain one of them belonged to someone still in the village. She wouldn't say who. She said it was too dangerous." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes kind. "Dangerous secrets often make themselves known, whether we speak them aloud or not. And when people are afraid, they betray themselves in little ways." Alice nodded miserably. "I'm afraid I'll be blamed for keeping her secret. The inspector says I've held back. But I swear, Miss Marple, I never knew more than that." Miss Marple reached across the table, patting her hand. "I believe you, child. And more importantly, I believe Lydia trusted you because she knew you would not gossip. That may yet prove your salvation." By now, Miss Marple had pieced together a picture clearer than most would imagine. The letters, the initials, the unease in Pritchard's face, the evasions of Mrs. Clement, the sharp defensiveness of Mrs. Price Ridley all were threads in a web that stretched back decades. What had happened at the rectory was no mere accident. It was an event shared, concealed, and guarded by more than one person. Lydia Barton had stumbled upon it, and she had paid the price. That evening, as the lamps were lit across St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her fire and considered her next move. It was time, she thought, to set a little test. Not a confrontation, not yet, but a gentle nudge to see which of her neighbors trembled when touched by memory. She began by writing a few invitations to tea. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing to alarm, but she worded them with a particular care, mentioning casually that she had come across something most interesting in the parish records and thought her friends might enjoy a little discussion. The following afternoon, her parlor was filled with familiar faces: Mrs. Price, Ridley, Mrs. Clement, Colonel Melchett, and even Mr. Pritchard, who arrived stiffly, clearly unwilling but unable to refuse. Alice served the tea, her hands only slightly less trembling than before. Miss Marple kept the conversation light at first gardens, the weather, small ailments. Then, as she poured a fresh cup, she remarked innocently, "It is remarkable, is it not, how old records can resurface? Why, I found a slip of paper only yesterday with initials and dates quite faded, but still legible. I dare say it might interest the inspector greatly." She glanced up just in time to see the ripple pass across the room. Mrs. Price Ridley's teacup rattled on its saucer. Colonel Melchett stiffened visibly, his hand tightening on his cane. Mr. Pritchard's face drained of color, while Mrs. Clement let out the faintest gasp before pressing her handkerchief to her lips. Miss Marple smiled sweetly, as though unaware of the effect. "Human nature, you see," she said, "has a most inconvenient way of betraying itself. One never knows when an old slip of paper might change everything." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with unspoken fear. And Miss Marple, behind her gentle smile, knew her net was drawing close. The uneasy silence that had hung over Miss Marple's tea-table lingered long after her guests departed. Each had left with polite words, but with faces betraying what their lips denied. Mrs. Price Ridley had marched away with stiff indignation, muttering about old busybodies. Mrs. Clement had nearly stumbled as she left, her eyes red as though she might burst into tears. Colonel Melchett departed brusquely, striking his cane hard against the path, while Mr. Pritchard vanished without a word, his jaw clenched tight. Miss Marple, alone again in her tidy parlour, folded her hands in her lap and allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. It was not merely what her guests had said or failed to say that mattered, but the involuntary reactions, the subtle betrayals of the human face. One could tell much about a person when they believed themselves unobserved. One could tell even more when they were startled by an unexpected remark. The slip of paper she had mentioned was real, of course, but what it contained mattered less than the terror it provoked. The following morning, Inspector Slack appeared at her door, brimming with self-importance. "Miss Marple," he announced, "I hear you entertained half the village yesterday. I trust you did not allow them to muddle your mind with their gossip?" Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "Oh, Inspector, you know how people chatter. Sometimes their chatter is most illuminating if one has the patience to listen." Slack snorted. "Illuminating nonsense. What matters is evidence. Pritchard is our man, and I mean to prove it. The letters, the handwriting, his evasions all fit neatly together." "Neatly," Miss Marple murmured, "is not always accurate. Life is rather more untidy than we like to suppose." Slack waved away her words. "You'll see, Miss Marple. I'll have this business tied up before the week is out." With that, he departed, leaving behind the faint scent of cigar smoke and self-satisfaction. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the churchyard. The place where Lydia Barton had fallen was quiet now, the grass already recovering from the disturbance of feet and lanterns. Miss Marple stood for some time by the wall, her eyes travelling thoughtfully over the stones, the path, the lichen-covered benches. She was not looking for footprints or broken branches that was the inspector's way. Instead, she was recalling faces, voices, gestures. She pictured Lydia Barton walking here, frightened but determined, clutching her fragment of paper. She imagined the hand that had silenced her, a hand perhaps trembling with desperation, perhaps steady with cold resolve. Her reverie was broken by the arrival of Alice, who had been sent on an errand by Mrs. Clement. The girl paused when she saw Miss Marple. "Oh, ma'am," she whispered, "do you think they'll ever find who did it? People look at me so strangely, as if I might know more than I've said." "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "those who look most accusingly are often those who fear suspicion themselves. Pay them no mind. But tell me, have you noticed anyone asking questions about Miss Barton's letters? Anyone who seemed particularly eager to know what she had discovered?" Alice hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Mr. Pritchard asked, once, and Mrs. Price Ridley, too. She stopped me on the lane and asked if I'd seen Miss Barton carrying papers. I said I hadn't, but she pressed me so hard I thought she'd shake the answer out of me." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Yes, that is just the sort of thing one might expect. People reveal much in the urgency of their questions." As Alice departed, Miss Marple considered the girl's words. Mrs. Price Ridley's zeal, Pritchard's caution, Mrs. Clement's distress, each told its own story. The pattern was tightening. That evening, Miss Marple invited Florence, her maid, to sit with her for a while. "You see, Florence," she explained, "people do not always lie with their tongues. More often, they lie with their silence. Yesterday, when I spoke of parish records, every face in the room betrayed fear, but their fears were not the same. Mrs. Clement's was the fear of shame. Mr. Pritchard's was the fear of ruin, Colonel Melchett's fear of exposure, and Mrs. Price Ridley, hers was afraid of discovery." Florence frowned. "But discovery of what, ma'am? That, my dear, is what we must uncover." The next day brought fresh drama. At the Blue Boar, voices were raised so loudly that the entire village soon knew of it. Mrs. Price Ridley had confronted Colonel Melchett, accusing him outright of knowing more about the rectory incident than he had admitted. "You were there, Colonel," she cried, her cheeks flushed crimson. "Your name was among those initials." Do not deny it. I shall tell the inspector myself. Melchett, furious, struck the table with his cane. How dare you, madam? I was not even in the parish at the time. My regiment was stationed abroad. If you repeat such slander, I shall hold you accountable. The innkeeper hurried to calm the quarrel, but the damage was done. By nightfall, half the village believed the colonel guilty, the other half certain Mrs. Price Ridley had overstepped. The web of suspicion had grown more tangled than ever. Miss Marple, listening to the tale relayed by Florence, allowed herself a small sigh. Quarrels of this sort were both revealing and misleading. They showed where tensions lay, but they also obscured the truth beneath clouds of anger and pride. Yet even quarrels had their value. People rarely quarreled over matters that did not touch them closely. That night, Miss Marple sat in her parlour and reviewed what she knew. Lydia Barton had found letters hidden deliberately among the hymnals. She had been frightened, but she had also been resolved. She spoke of others more than one who bore guilt for an old crime at the rectory. She died clutching a scrap that read, "It was murder." The bundle of letters in the pond suggested a desperate attempt to erase the past. But they had not been erased quickly enough. Panic had betrayed someone who knew where to look, and who acted clumsily in haste. Miss Marple leaned back, her needles resting in her lap. The circle was tightening, yes, but the center of it remained shadowed. Still, she felt certain the truth was near. People who lived with secrets for decades rarely bore them gracefully. Age made them careless, desperation made them reckless. And recklessness, Miss Marple knew, was always the beginning of revelation. She resolved that the time had come for one final test, gentle one, subtle enough to appear harmless, but keen enough to pierce the armor of pretense. She would not confront her neighbors with accusations that were not her way. She would instead offer them the chance to reveal themselves. A casual remark, a feigned ignorance, a little story of her own invention, these were her tools, and with them she would watch who stumbled, who bristled, who betrayed. For Jane Marple, the net was ready. All that remained was to draw it in. Miss Marple had always believed that the truth, once ripened, revealed itself with little more than a nudge. She had reached that point now, after days of quiet listening and careful watching. The circle of guilt had narrowed, though the inspector continued to bluster about Mr. Pritchard, and the villagers remained divided in their theories. To Miss Marple, however, the threads had begun to weave into a discernible pattern. It was with deliberate purpose, then, that she asked the vicar to arrange a small gathering in the parish hall. Merely a meeting of comfort and clarity, she explained sweetly, to remind everyone that truth brings peace, and rumour only brings distress. The vicar, eager to soothe his troubled flock, readily agreed. By late afternoon, the parish hall was prepared, the long wooden table set with tea-things and chairs arranged in a circle. The atmosphere was uneasy, as though everyone sensed something unusual about the summons. Colonel Melchett arrived first, cane tapping against the floor, his expression a mixture of irritation and curiosity. Mrs. Price Ridley entered next, her chin raised high, lips pursed in disapproval. Mrs. Clement came hesitantly, clutching her handkerchief. Mr. Pritchard appeared last, stiff and formal, his eyes shadowed by strain. Alice, the maid, hovered near the doorway, nervous but unwilling to leave. Miss Marple sat serenely at the head of the table, her knitting basket beside her, needles moving softly as though this were the most ordinary of afternoons. The effect was disarming. Few realized that beneath her gentle demeanor lay a mind prepared for a test more precise than any the inspector might devise. "My dear friends," Miss Marple began kindly, "it grieves me to see our village so troubled. Poor Miss Barton's death has cast a long shadow, and yet I am certain that the truth, though painful, will bring release to us all. You see, secrets weigh heavily, and those who carry them suffer most of all." The silence that followed was thick. Colonel Melchett cleared his throat. Yes, very good. but I fail to see how this gathering will help us." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "Perhaps by bringing together those most affected, we may better understand the past. For what happened in the rectory so many years ago has not vanished. It lingers, does it not, in our present troubles?" Mrs. Price Ridley shifted uneasily. "If you mean those letters, Miss Marple, I consider them malicious fabrications. Reverend Channing was a godly man. To suggest otherwise is slander." "Not slander, madam," Mr. Pritchard interjected coldly. "Evidence. The handwriting was his. I will not deny it." Mrs. Clement let out a soft cry. "Please, must we speak of it so bluntly? My husband is distraught enough as it is. To have a scandal linked to the parish is unbearable." Miss Marple looked around the circle, her eyes mild, her tone deceptively gentle. And yet Lydia Barton thought it important enough to pursue. "She found more than one letter, you know. She confided as much, and when those letters surfaced, someone here panicked. Someone feared the past would no longer remain hidden." Mr. Pritchard's jaw tightened. Colonel Melchett gripped his cane with white knuckles. Mrs. Price Ridley dabbed at her brow with a lace handkerchief. Mrs. Clement sat very still, her lips pressed together. Alice, at the door, looked ready to flee. "I often think," Miss Marple continued, "how curious it is that truth and guilt reveal themselves in the smallest ways. A glance, a tremor of the hand, an eagerness to accuse one's neighbor, all a telling. When I mentioned the parish records, at tea, each of you betrayed something of yourself. It was most enlightening." Her eyes rested briefly on each face in turn. The silence deepened, taut as wire. "You see," she went on, "the crime Lydia uncovered was not hers to bear, but ours to remember. The rectory fire of 1913 was no accident. It was the result of folly, Reverend Channing's folly, yes, but not his alone. Others were present, others swore to silence, and Lydia, poor child, found proof of it." Mrs. Clement let out a strangled sob. Colonel Melchett muttered, "This is absurd." Mrs. Price Ridley rose to her feet, trembling with indignation. "I will not sit here and listen to this nonsense." Miss Marple raised a calming hand. "Do sit, my dear. The time for running away has passed. We must face what is before us, for the true murderer is not hidden in shadows any longer. Fear has betrayed them, desperation has undone them." She allowed her words to hang in the air, watching carefully. Mrs. Price Ridley sank back into her chair, her face pale. Mr. Pritchard averted his gaze. Colonel Melchett tapped his cane so hard it echoed in the hall, and Mrs. Clement buried her face in her handkerchief, shoulders shaking. At last Miss Marple folded her knitting and set it aside. The inspector will, of course, require evidence, but evidence comes in many forms. Human nature, after all, is the most reliable witness of all. She rose slowly, her small figure seeming suddenly formidable in its calm authority. "Tomorrow I shall speak plainly. Tonight, let each of us consider what it means to bear a secret and what it costs to keep it. The truth, I think, is already known in your hearts." With that, she dismissed the gathering. They departed in silence, each weighed down by fear, shame, or defiance. When the hall was empty, Miss Marple stood alone in the fading light, her expression unreadable. The test had worked. The guilty party had betrayed themselves not with words, but with the unmistakable signs of a conscience under siege. Tomorrow, she promised herself, the net would close entirely, and the murderer of Lydia Barton would stand revealed. The morning after the parish hall gathering dawned clear, with a golden light that seemed almost mocking in its cheerfulness. St. Mary Mead looked as it always did, cottages with whitewashed walls, roses climbing the fences, hens scratching in the dust. Yet beneath the surface, the village held its breath. Word had spread that Miss Marple intended to speak, and when she spoke, people listened. Inspector Slack, irritable from lack of sleep, was the first to arrive at the vicarage. "You've stirred up more fuss than I can manage, Miss Marple," he grumbled. "The whole village is in a state. If you've got something to say, best come out with it." Miss Marple sat serenely in the drawing-room, her lace gloves folded neatly in her lap. "All in good time, Inspector. One mustn't rush these things. Truth, like bread, must be properly baked, or it will not hold together." Colonel Melchett joined them soon after, cane tapping on the floorboards, followed by Mrs. Price Ridley, stiff with indignation, and Mr. Pritchard, whose jaw was clenched so tightly that his words emerged only in short bursts. Mrs. Clement entered last, pale and trembling, supported by her husband. Alice hovered once more near the doorway, wide-eyed and anxious. The vicar, though nervous, urged them all to sit. "Miss Marple believes she can shed light on this dreadful business," he said. "For the peace of the parish, let us hear her out." Miss Marple inclined her head and began, her voice calm, almost conversational. "We have all been troubled by the letters discovered in the vestry and later in the pond. They spoke of an accident at the rectory, an accident that was no accident at all. They hinted at a conspiracy of silence shared by more than one person. Poor Lydia Barton uncovered those letters and realized their significance. She was killed for it." Slack leaned forward. "Killed by Pritchard, no doubt. He knew the handwriting. He was evasive." "He not Mr. Pritchard," Miss Marple interrupted gently. Though he feared the ruin of reputations, his concern was for discretion, not guilt. His trembling hands revealed anxiety, yes, but not the cold resolve of murder. Pritchard let out a breath he had been holding, though his relief was tempered by continued unease. Miss Marple turned her gaze to the Colonel. "Colonel Melchett, your defensiveness was striking. You bristled at every suggestion, quick to deny. Yet you were abroad during Reverend Channing's tenure, and your name was not among the initials. Your bluster concealed no crime, only pride." The Colonel harumphed, muttering something about village gossip, but his shoulders eased ever so slightly. Her eyes shifted then to Mrs. Price Ridley. "You, madame, were the most eager to accuse others. You pressed Alice for answers. You declared Pritchard guilty at every turn. It is often the way with those who wish to deflect suspicion. And yet your fear at the mention of parish records was telling." Mrs. Price Ridley's face turned a mottled red. "How dare you insinuate?" "Not guilty of murder," Miss Marple said firmly, her voice cutting through the protest, "but guilty of knowledge. You were aware of the old scandal and concealed it, fearing it might touch your family. That is why you quailed at the thought of records being uncovered." The formidable woman subsided, lips pressed tight, her indignation unable to mask the tremor in her hands. Finally, Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Clement. The room seemed to grow still, all eyes fixed upon the vicar's wife. She sat with her handkerchief twisted tightly in her lap, her face pale as parchment. "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, "your distress has been greater than anyone's. You spoke of Lydia coming to you before the garden party, asking about parish records. You told no one at the time, fearing scandal, and when I mentioned records at tea, your gasp was not of surprise, it was of recognition." Mrs. Clement let out a faint moan, and the vicar reached for her hand. "Jane," he whispered, "surely this cannot be true." Miss Marple continued gently but firmly. "You were present at the rectory all those years ago, were you not? A young woman then, visiting Reverend Channing. You were among those who swore to silence when the fire claimed the life of the servant girl. The letters made it plain there were others, initials recorded, and one of them was yours. Lydia discovered it, and you feared she would reveal it. That fear drove you to act." Mrs. Clement shook her head wildly, tears spilling down her cheeks. "No, I never meant. It was an accident. Channing's carelessness, the lamp overturned, the curtains aflame. We swore to silence because the scandal would have destroyed him, the church, and all of us. Lydia would not let it rest. She said she must tell the truth. I only meant to stop her, to plead with her. She struggled. She slipped. Her voice broke, and the room filled with horrified silence. Inspector Slack scribbled furiously in his notebook, though even he looked shaken. "So you admit Mrs. Clement covered her face?" "I did not strike her. I only meant to frighten her into silence. But when she fell, when she struck her head, I knew she was gone. And then the fragment of paper, she clutched it so tightly. I could not take it from her hand." The vicar sat stricken, his face ashen. "My dear wife," he whispered, "why did you not tell me?" Miss Marple's eyes were compassionate, though steady. "Because, my dear vicar, shame is a heavier chain than any prison. She carried it for 20 years, and when Lydia uncovered it, she could bear no more." Slack cleared his throat. "Well, the matter is plain enough. An accidental death, perhaps, but preceded by deliberate concealment and followed by panic. The law will decide her culpability." But Miss Marple shook her head. "The law may do as it must, but the truth has been spoken, and that will ease the burden of many hearts, though it weighs heavily on one. Poor Lydia died seeking it, and we must honor her courage." The gathering broke apart slowly, in heavy silence. Mrs. Price Ridley departed, muttering about disgrace. Mr. Pritchard looked grim, but oddly relieved. Colonel Melchett strode out stiffly, his cane striking the ground in harsh rhythm. Inspector Slack followed, already framing his report in officious terms. Only the vicar and his wife remained. Mrs. Clement sat broken, her sobs filling the quiet room. The vicar, devastated but steadfast, placed his hand gently on hers. Miss Marple rose, gathering her knitting. "I'm so sorry, my dear," she said softly. "But sometimes the only way to free the living is to speak the truth of the dead. You will find that confession, however painful, brings its own mercy." That evening, as dusk fell over St. Mary Mead, the village seemed oddly subdued. Gossip still fluttered through the hedgerows, but it carried less bite. People spoke in hushed tones, not of scandal, but of pity for Lydia, pity even for Mrs. Clement, who had lived too long under the shadow of silence. In her own cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her needles clicking softly. Florence, her maid, asked hesitantly, "Ma'am, do you think it will be the same in the village again?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, not the same, Florence. Things are never quite the same after such a storm. But people are resilient. They will tend their gardens, bake their cakes, quarrel and make up, just as before. Only perhaps with a little more caution in their hearts. For human nature, my dear, is ever curious, so frail, so foolish, and yet so very enduring." She returned to her knitting, the firelight warming her gentle face. Outside, the bells of St. Mary Mead tolled the hour, steady and calm, as if to remind the village that life, however shaken, goes on.